The sound of vinegar-soaked rags striking stone floors and the dull, rhythmic thud of bodies being thrown into wooden carts, these were the vibrations that signaled in real time the dismantling of the medieval mind. In 1347, the port of Messina did not merely receive 12 Genoese galleys, it welcomed a biological collapse that tore away, layer by layer, the illusions of feudal order that had upheld Europe for 1,000 years. The sailors aboard those ships were not crying out for help. They lay slumped over the oars, their skin darkened by blood pooling beneath the surface in necrotic bluish maps. When the townspeople finally forced open the hatches, the stench of rotting cloth and stagnant bilge water did more than hit the air. It poisoned the very foundation of social trust, turning neighbors into strangers and family members into biological threats before the sun had even set. This was not a sudden cinematic event, but the slow mechanical failure of a systemic engine that had grown too populous and too rigid to breathe. For centuries, the feudal ladder had kept every individual locked into a fixed psychological compartment. You were born into a debt of endless labor and died within the same square kilometer of land where your ancestors had rotted. The arrival of the bacterium Yersinia pestis transformed this predictable hierarchy into a death trap, as the primal fear shifted from the loss of life to the loss of the invisible thread that held the universe together. If the local priest died before hearing your final confession, your soul was considered adrift. If the feudal lord perished, his ancestral land lost its name, its law, and its protection, leaving the survivor in an absolute existential vacuum. We notice this same friction today when our modern global systems, the digital networks and invisible supply chains we take for granted, show the slightest tremor of instability. Like a terrified peasant in the 1340s, we realize that our normal is, in fact, a fragile consensus maintained by the participation of billions of people we will never meet, yet upon whom we depend for our basic sanity. In a candlelit room in London, a notary with trembling hands signs his name on a chaotic pile of wills, the ink smearing because he works too quickly to let the parchment dry. He is the silent architect witnessing the birth of a new economic reality, one in which human life, for the first time in history, carries a premium price tag. Before the plague, labor was cheap and humans were considered disposable assets of the crown, spare parts in an endless agrarian machine. Yet after a third of the population vanished, the survivors looked at their calloused hands and saw a new form of leverage. The farmhand who once begged for a crust of moldy bread now demanded double the wage and a seat at the table, effectively ending the era of silent, unquestioned servitude through the simple law of supply and demand. This shift in power did not occur on battlefields, but in the silence of kitchens and at merchants' counters. The landowner, accustomed to absolute command, suddenly found himself begging for his fields to be harvested, offering concessions his grandparents would have considered heretical. The class structure was not toppled by a political revolution, but by a demographic vacuum that forced the elite to negotiate with those who had once been invisible. For the noble, the world was ending. For the low-born survivor, the world was, for the first time, beginning to offer choices. The psychological shift cut far deeper than mere coins or land rights, striking at the core of how humans process the concept of divine justice and cosmic order. For generations, the Church had promised that suffering followed a moral logic, that the good were spared and the wicked punished. But the plague operated with clinical, mathematical indifference. It took the bishop in his silk vestments and the thief in the gutter with the same agonizing efficiency, permanently shattering collective trust in institutional protection. This forced survivors to look inward or toward the bizarre, developing the art of the danse macabre not as a morbid hobby, but as a necessary psychological defense mechanism to process the fact that the systemic safety net was, and always had been, a ghost. This pivot from blind institutional faith to raw, survivor-driven individual agency mirrors our own modern shift toward skepticism of large-scale authorities during global crises. When the 14th century's experts, physicians clutching aromatic herbs and priests gripping crucifixes, failed to stop the body count, survivors stopped asking permission to think for themselves. The collapse of medical and religious authority created an empty space in which empirical observation and doubt began to flourish, planting the seeds of what would become the scientific method. The transition from a world of lords to a world of markets and innovation happened in the dusty, overgrown corners of thousands of abandoned villages. A rusted key left hanging in the door of an abandoned manor where an entire noble lineage had died out became the silent tombstone of an entire era of human governance. The land did not disappear, but the desperate people who once worked it for free were gone, forcing the remaining elite to innovate technologically or face total economic extinction. It was this desperation that funded the first experiments in labor-saving technologies, more efficient ships that required fewer sailors, printing presses that replaced armies of scribes, and agricultural tools that multiplied the strength of a single man. Capital, once locked away in castles and ceremonial jewels, began to flow toward utility. With fewer mouths to feed, there was an unexpected surplus of food and goods for those who remained, creating what historians call the first age of consumption for the working classes. The survivor now had silver coins in his pocket, and with them, the ability to buy clothes, meat, and tools that his ancestors had only seen from afar. Consumption became an act of affirming life against the omnipresence of death. When the funeral bells finally stopped ringing, Europe had been squeezed through a violent, narrow bottleneck that purged the inefficiencies of the Middle Ages through sheer trauma. The impact of the Black Death produced a leaner, more aggressive, and deeply inquisitive society that paved the way for the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery with the blood of its predecessors. It taught the Western mind that systems are never permanent and that the future belongs to those willing to break old rules to survive in a radically changing world. We are the direct descendants of those who looked upon a civilization in flames and chose to rebuild it with more resilient, human-centered materials. The legacy of the plague is not merely a footnote about disease, but the genetic code of our modernity. Every time we question an institution, every time we demand value for our time, and every time we use technology to overcome a physical limitation, we are echoing the trauma and triumph of those who survived 1347. They discovered in the hardest way possible that when the system dies, the individual is forced to be born.